Good evening, everybody. It's great to have you all here. I want to welcome you to tonight's webinar, Who Profits from the Genocide, organized by the Palestinian Return Centre. The Palestinian Return Centre is an independent organization based in London, which advocates, as the name suggests, for Palestinians' inalienable right to return to their homeland. My name is Sophia Hoffinger, and I will moderate the event tonight and have the great honor to introduce our distinguished panel of speakers to you tonight. So the webinar tonight seeks to discuss and call out international complicity in the Israeli-led genocide in Gaza, a genocide that is now in its 677th day, has been part of a deliberate effort to make the Gaza Strip uninhabitable to its indigenous population, and has claimed the lives of over 60,000 Palestinians, many of whom have been killed by deploying weapons supplied to the occupation by Germany, Britain, the United States, and other complicit countries. Beyond national governments, corporate entities have also profited from ongoing settler colonialism in Palestine for decades, ignoring their obligations under international law, as has been outlined in a recent published report by the Special Rapporteur on the Occupied Palestinian Territory, Francesca Albanese, entitled From Economy of Occupation to Economy of Genocide. Our speakers tonight will address the web of international complicity from different angles of their work. I'm honored to welcome Michael Link, former Special Rapporteur to the Occupied Palestinian Territories, Kimia from Energy Embargo Palestine, Inez from the Palestinian Youth Movement, and Yasmin from the Crimes and Complicity team at the European Legal Support Center. Each speaker will get 15 minutes for their presentation, and at the end of their presentations, we will have a short amount of time for questions and answers. So the viewers are more than welcome to ask any questions through the chat function on either YouTube or on Facebook, wherever you're watching from. So I'm happy to introduce our first guest tonight, our first speaker tonight, Michael Link. Michael Link is an associate professor at the Faculty of Law, Western University in London, Ontario. And as I said, the former Special Rapporteur for the human rights situation in the Palestinian territories occupied since 1967. Michael, the floor is yours.
Sophia, thank you very much for this introduction. And it's a great pleasure and an honor to be asked to join this webinar on this vital topic on the nature of war economies in our era, and with specific reference paid to the forces fueling Israel's genocide in Gaza and the 58-year-old unlawful occupation. In the time allotted to me today, I want to focus on the indispensable report that was recently issued by my successor for human rights in the occupied Palestinian territory, Francesca Albanese. During the course of Israel's carnage in Gaza, and the 2.2 million Palestinians living there since that have been going on since October 2023, Francesca has issued three reports to the United Nations about what the world has been witnessing going on in Gaza. In her first two reports, issued in March and then in October 2024, and both presented to the United Nations, Francesca has called Israel's military campaign a genocide, citing the 1948 Genocide Convention, and matching the facts and evidence that she and others have been able to gather with respect to the atrocities inflicted upon the Palestinian population to the law with respect to war crimes, crimes against humanity, and ultimately to genocide. During and since Francesca's two reports in 2024, a number of prominent human rights organizations and well-respected former international humanitarian leaders have said that Israel's military campaign in Gaza amounts to a genocide. Among these prominent voices have been Amnesty International, which issued a decisive report, a very lengthy and evidence-rich report in December 2024, Doctors Without Borders, or Médecins Sans Frontières, Al-Haq, B'Tselem, Joseph Borrell's, who until 2024 was the foreign affairs chief for the European Union, and Martin Griffiths, who also until 2024 was the former head of the humanitarian affairs for the United Nations, among many others. So in her most recent report, issued at the end of June 2025, Francesca Albanese has again addressed the question of Israel, Gaza, and genocide, but with a new lens on her camera. This time, with her most recent report, she's looking at this very specific and very disturbing feature of this ongoing genocide, which is the role of corporations, primarily international corporations, in aiding and assisting Israel's military-industrial complex, which has been central not only to sustaining and deepening Israel's 58-year-old unlawful occupation, but in launching and continuing this carnage in Gaza. In her new report, Francesca has contributed mightily to our understanding of the wider features of this war on Gaza. As such, her report stands both as a permanent record of what the corporate private sector, primarily from the global north, has done to enable Israel's genocide, but also as a call to action and to hold those responsible for the genocide, both state actors and private actors, politically and legally answerable to the law and to public opinion for what they have done, for what they haven't done to halt this live stream genocide. Let's remember that the 1948 Genocide Convention, the first human rights genocide convention adopted by the United Nations, was enacted for a very special purpose. It was adopted in order to give, it was not adopted in order to give comfort to historians 20 years from now or 30 years from now, so that they can look back into 2025 and say, gee, according to the Genocide Convention of 1948, what happened in Gaza from 2023 onward matches the definition of a genocide. No, that's not its purpose. Its purpose was enacted so that a genocide or genocide in the making would be stopped immediately by the member states of the United Nations acting in full responsibility of their legal obligations under the Genocide Convention and under the UN Charter. There's a story that I came across recently involving Anthony Lake, a name that may not be known to very many of you. But 30 years ago, in the mid-1990s, he served as the National Security Advisor to President Bill Clinton of the United States. And it was on his watch and their watch in 1994 that a genocide very quickly gathered steam in Rwanda. And Anthony Lake talked about subsequently the debates that occurred among senior State Department officials, among national security advisors, and among the senior staff around Bill Clinton, including the president himself, as to whether or not they could use the G word when it came to what was happening in Rwanda. And there was great reluctance in those days to want to use the word genocide, because they understood if this was a genocide, and they called it as such, they'd be obliged to join with other nations to do everything reasonably responsible within the bounds of law to bring this genocide to an end. And they didn't want to get involved. And I can think 30 years later, the same kinds of attributes of timidity and lack of courage have been occurring with respect to the political leaders, particularly in the global north, where they're not willing to use the word genocide because they know if they did, that would commit them to action under the 1948 genocide, not only to end their complicity by their state and by companies under their jurisdiction, but also by their lack of political action to mobilize to end Israel's carnage, indeed genocide in Gaza. So in my short time today with you on this panel, I want to highlight a couple of aspects from Francesca's report that I think are key takeaway points that we should all retain and act upon. The first thing has to do with corporate responsibility under international law. And in the appendix to Francesca's June 2025 report, she lays out, I think, in language understandable by anybody, lawyer and non-lawyer, of what it means to apply legal responsibilities and legal obligations on corporations that when they do business abroad, particularly when they are involved in conflict zones, or in occupations or in areas where significant human rights violations may be occurring. In describing this, I want to say that when we speak of international domestic law and corporations, we are speaking about the terms I'll use are hard law and soft law. Hard law is commonly understood to be those statutes and those conventions where meaningful political consequences can follow a finding of a violation of international law. Soft law refers to those guidelines, UN General Assembly resolutions or resolutions coming from the UN Human Rights Council, and those principles that have not yet hardened into actionable hard law, but are still very meaningful because this soft law represents both law in the making, what's soft law today may well be hard law tomorrow, and also those standards coming largely from the United Nations, where businesses have voluntarily agreed to incorporate into their corporate practices, and which therefore they can be held politically and morally responsible in the court of public opinion for failing to live up to what they put their signature on. My point here is that litigation and prosecution under hard law are vital tools in our accountability toolbox, but we can also use the law, including soft law as well as hard law, to build effective public campaigns to change corporate behavior and to influence public opinion. Now, when we speak about hard law, particularly with respect to a genocide or genocide in the making, what we're referring to are those international pieces of legislation that involve individual responsibility. So this could include the 1948 Genocide Convention, which forbids not only genocide, but it forbids making genocidal statements. It also forbids complicity in genocide. We're also talking about the 1949 Geneva Conventions, which is the beating heart of what we call international humanitarian law. International humanitarian law is a law that regulates conflicts and wars as well as occupations. And many, many countries, including those in the global north, Europe and in North America, have incorporated the Geneva Conventions into their domestic laws. As well, we're talking about the 1998 Rome Statute, which created the International Criminal Court. And the Rome Statute wound up giving jurisdiction to this new International Criminal Court based in The Hague over specific listings of war crimes, crimes against humanity, wars of aggression, but also genocide as well. And this is important not only for focusing on the two courts, the two international courts that are based in The Hague, the International Court of Justice, which hears disputes between nations and is the highest court in the UN system, but also the International Criminal Court, formed in the aftermath of the creation of the 1998 Rome Statute, which looks at individual criminal responsibility for those who may be involved in, as I said, war crimes or crimes against humanity or international law. But there's also hard law at the domestic level as well, at the country level, because there's 125 countries, about 2/3 of the states in the world, who've signed on to the Rome Statute, and almost all of them have incorporated the Rome Statute into their domestic legislation. So that's created, if you like, something called universal jurisdiction. So we don't simply have to wait on someone to make an application to the International Criminal Court, for example, for them to do the investigation and to decide whether or not they're going to issue arrest warrants against leaders or against warlords. But these can also be tried at the domestic level as well, because the Rome Statute is part of many countries, if you like, criminal code, and complaints can be made at the national level that would issue arrest warrants or arrest a potential war criminal that's on their soil. That's the hard law. The soft law that I'm going to refer to, and which is evident and prominently mentioned in Francesca's 2025 report, primarily revolve around the UN guiding principles on business and human rights. And here, based on this, corporations are required both to avoid violating human rights laws in their operations domestically or internationally, but also to address human rights violations resulting from their own business relationships with others. And if I can just quote and point out a couple of them to you. Remember, these are soft law obligations that these corporations and pension funds and universities and many different types of enterprises have voluntarily signed on to. What I fear is that these corporations and universities and pension funds and other enterprises have signed on as a method of performance, a theater, that it looks good when they can proclaim on their website that they indeed are virtuous because they've signed on to the UN guiding principles. But what does it actually mean in practice? These are not formal hard law legal standards, but these are standards that these enterprises and universities and pension funds have voluntarily signed on to, and therefore they can be held morally and politically responsible for their investments in either directly in, say, the weapons industry, or their investments in companies that are active in the illegal and Israeli settlements in the occupied territory. So these are all tools, I think, in our expanding toolbox that we can wind up using this. So what are the responsibilities of corporate entities that have signed on to the UN principles for guiding principles for business and human rights? And they include, they say there's a three-part series of what they're responsible for. First is that corporations and enterprises that have signed on to the guiding principles have agreed not to cause human rights violations, primarily due to their own particular activities wherever they may be. Second of all, they've signed on to not to contribute to violations through their own activities, either directly or indirectly. And thirdly, they've signed on to making sure that the kinds of companies and supply chains that they have either created business relationships with or invested in through their pension funds or through other forms of investment are not themselves involved in corporate violations of human rights, contrary to what they've agreed to with respect to the guiding principles on business and human rights. And these have become, if you like, I think, powerful tools for corporations, for activists to be able to raise in their political campaigns around divestment, with respect to investment in the military-industrial complex, with respect to, say, occupation tourism, investments in companies like Airbnb or Booking.com or Expedia, all of whom are active in renting units based in the unlawful Israeli settlements that are at the heart of the unlawful Israeli occupation in the occupied Palestinian territories. And so these signing on to these standards puts a prima facie obligation on these corporations to ensure, when it comes to a conflict zone in general, or the conflict zone that is Israel and Palestine, to ensure that their activities and their investments and their business relationships do not violate Palestinian self-determination, do not aid Israel in its legal and de facto annexation of Palestinian territory or the maintenance of the unlawful occupation. It also means that they have to ensure that in the terms of Israel and Palestine, they're not contributing to the crimes of apartheid and genocide. And as well, they have to be careful for all not to be engaged in any other ancillary crimes and violations as well. This gives activists, I think, a fairly broad range of tools to be able to use with respect to the target of corporate responsibility in Israel and Palestine, and how that winds up furthering Israel's genocide in Gaza and the war crimes being committed by continuing the unlawful occupation in the West Bank. And one last point as a point for all of us to keep in mind. You probably all know that the 360 or so Israeli settlements are a violation of the Fourth Geneva Convention that have been deemed to be so by UN Security Council resolutions. But they are also, under international law, a war crime as well. They're a war crime under the 1949 Geneva Conventions, and they're also a war crime under the 1998 Rome Statute. This elevates the Israeli settlements to a particularly serious type of violation of international law, and that should be a key campaign point in any of our work with respect to pointing to investments by companies in the Israeli settlements, including what I've just mentioned with respect to occupation tourism. But there are almost 100 companies that are listed in the 2023 UN database created by the High Commissioner for Human Rights to determine companies that have direct involvement with respect to these legal Israeli settlements. So Francesca's wonderful report and her prior reports as well have all given us an immense amount of rich evidence, rich facts to be able to use to direct our campaigns in a strategic fashion to try to break these linkages between Western state and Western corporate complicity and what is going on in the occupied Palestinian territories. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Michael, also for pointing out again very clearly states and corporate responsibilities in what we've been witnessing, and I think also for drawing out the connections between law and the potentials of law and activist campaigns around divestments. I think tonight's panel speaks to, or hopefully they will be able to speak to some of the ways in which activists can mobilize, beyond the ICC and ICJ. But next, we have Kimia from Energy Embargo Palestine. Energy Embargo for Palestine is an anti-imperialist organization based in Britain, responding to the call from Palestinian trade unions to disrupt the flow of energy to Israel. So, Kimia, thank you so much for joining us. And go ahead.
Thank you, Sophia, for the introduction and for inviting us to this webinar. It's a real honor to speak alongside people who are doing such good work for Palestine. My name is Kimia, and I'm an organizer with Energy Embargo for Palestine, an anti-imperialist organization based in Britain, responding to the call from Palestinian trade unions to disrupt the flow of energy to Israel. We currently have a campaign targeting BP for its role in fueling Israel's genocide. So before I speak about our campaigns and some of the work that we do, I first want to give a quick grounding on a question we get asked a lot. Why do we focus on energy? So the extraction and plunder of fossil fuels in the Middle East has been integral to the colonial ventures and imperialist militarization of global North countries like the US, Britain, the Netherlands, and more. And this flow of energy has allowed these states to compete with each other historically and to continue to plunder for more oil reserves, more expansion across the globe. And since the British Mandate and the early arrival of Zionist settlers, energy has been crucial in powering the settler occupation of Palestine. Zionist settlers during the Mandate, for example, built extensive electricity grids to fuel the settlements they were building on in occupied land. And as Britain and many other powers moved to safeguard their interests in the Middle East and to ensure this continued flow of oil towards the global north, the establishment of Israel actually served this purpose to ethnically cleanse all of historic Palestine, to seize natural resources, and to use and export its fuel supplies for the consolidation of US and NATO hegemonic power. And this is why, like, many people actually identify that Israel is a US and British outpost. And we can still presently see how energy is used to power the military infrastructure of Israel. We can see it through the military jets and vehicles that are razing to the ground schools, hospitals, and systematically murdering Palestinians in Gaza. And this is whilst Palestinians face a blockade on fuel and other basic commodities. Israel's energy exports have also played a central role in exploitative normalization deals with neighboring Arab states. And these energy deals have actually provided an extra layer of security and legitimization for Israel in the wider region. So given the reliance that Israel has on the flow of coal, crude oil, and jet fuel to fuel both its genocide and its settler colonial project, we campaign for an energy embargo on Israel, and due to our location in Britain, we primarily focus on BP. So British Petroleum, originally named the Anglo-Persian Oil Company, has a long history of colonialism, labor exploitation, coup orchestration, and now fueling and profiting from genocide. So how is BP complicit in Israel's genocide? So BP's significant contribution to Israeli energy imports is largely due to their ownership of the Baku-Tbilisi-Ceyhan pipeline, which transports BP-owned Azerbaijani crude oil to the Turkish port of Ceyhan, where it is then shipped to Israel, to the port of Ashkelon. And when that oil actually arrives in Israel, it is sent to the Ashdod refinery, and then it's refined into jet fuel. And that refinery currently holds at least one contract with the IOF for supplying jet fuel. And in the first year of the intensified genocide following October 7th, the BTC pipeline actually supplied Israel with 28% of its oil. And BP is embedded in every part of this supply chain, delivering oil to Israel. A BP subsidiary owns the oil fields where the oil is extracted in Azerbaijan, and BP operates the terminal that receives and stores oil before sending it through to the BTC pipeline. Our investigative report, which came out, I believe, like September last year, Pipeline to Genocide, BP's Oil Route to Israel, provides an in-depth analysis on the BTC pipeline's history and politics. And to summarize this publication, the BTC pipeline was built in the 1990s in response to US and British influence on the newly independent Azerbaijan. And this contract of the century that was signed in 1994 between Western energy companies, including BP and the Azerbaijani government, actually allowed Azerbaijan to develop its oil fields with support from Western energy companies, with initial profits going primarily towards these companies. And BP is still currently the joint largest shareholder of this crude oil pipeline. Through their involvement in the oil industry, BP and its Western allies have molded Azerbaijan into a client state that now serves as a key ally to Israel. And Israel has further supplied Azerbaijan with weapons to use against Armenians. So BP has also been directly involved in Israel's natural gas sector since March 2025. On the 17th of March 2025, BP was actually awarded gas exploration licenses as part of a consortium with SOCAR and the Israeli energy company NewMed. And these gas exploration licenses actually allow this SOCAR BP NewMed consortium to explore the zone known as Cluster 1, which is a 1,700 square kilometer area near the Leviathan gas field that is operated by the energy company Chevron. And these licenses were initially announced in October 2023, but the project was delayed, obviously, as a result of Israel's genocide. And interestingly, Declassified recently came out with, from investigating Zippy Hotoveli's diaries, the Israeli ambassador to the UK, that the ambassador met privately with Michael Dennison, who is BP's head of international advisory, just days after BP was awarded these licenses. Dennison's role, to quote, includes developing relationships with the UK FCDO and foreign diplomatic missions in London. And this really demonstrates the close links and lobbying between the British state, BP, and Israel over these gas licenses. And in some new research that we will be releasing soon, we actually identified that in April 2025, BP was awarded a contract alongside 15 other companies to supply fuel to RAF bases. And the bases mentioned in the contract actually include RAF Akrotiri, where RAF fighter jets are actually known to undertake surveillance flights over Gaza to provide intelligence for Israel. And some research that recently came out has demonstrated that the RAF actually allows Israeli Air Force planes involved in Gaza's bombings to land at its Bryce Norton base, which is being refueled by BP fuel. And this research demonstrates that, again, we can't separate the operations of so-called private companies like BP with state interests and complicity. As Michael mentioned in Francesca Albanese's new report, Albanese actually names BP alongside Chevron as some of the largest contributors to Israel's oil imports. And she says that by supplying Israel with coal, gas, oil, and fuel, companies are contributing to civilian infrastructures that Israel uses to entrench permanent annexation and weaponizes in the destruction of Palestinian life. So to bring it back to energy embargo for Palestine, how does this research inform our campaigns? So BP, which is headquartered in Britain, externalizes many of its operations abroad. This means that we've had to try to grasp what the pressure points of BP are in trying to isolate them and to kind of popularize a mass international campaign against their complicity. So we have multiple fronts to our BP campaign. Our first front is targeting BP's social license to operate. Many companies that are destroying both people and the planet, they find a way to kind of garner public legitimacy for their operations and try to force themselves into our day-to-day lives, whether that's through educational institutions, universities, arts and culture. And that is their social license to operate. And to quote BP, they say it makes people buy our products, apply for our vacancies, invest in our shares, or accept our presence in their communities. So for the past 18 months, alongside supporters, activists, and museum staff, we've been running a sustained pressure campaign demanding that the British Museum sever all ties to BP, including its £50 million sponsorship deal. The British Museum, we believe, is a strategic pressure point against BP. For years, BP have used the British Museum as a platform for covert lobbying from Mexico to Israel to reach high-level decision makers. And we've disrupted the museum's operations at multiple occasions. We've successfully shut it down through mass mobilizations. We've disrupted events that they've planned and joint events that they've planned with BP. And we've done further research explicating the links between the British state, BP, and the museum. And I guess nothing could have demonstrated these links more than the recent Genocide Gala that was held by the Israeli embassy in secret at the British Museum around 2 months ago. And we leaked that the British Museum actually lied to its own staff, its own workers, and the Israeli embassy invited the likes of Nigel Farage, Kemi Badenoch, and strangely Jimmy Carr, with Maria Eagle, the F-35 jet minister, as we like to call her, celebrating the RAF surveillance flights over Gaza. And since then, we've supported worker mobilizations within the museum and across the cultural space and presented demands to the British Museum to apologise for this event and to cut all ties with BP. We've gotten a lot of recent public traction on this campaign, and some new FOIs have actually come out and revealed that the British Museum willingly held this event, in contrast to the kind of PR statements that they can't detract, apparently, from British foreign policy. We know that this is a popular and winnable campaign. We've seen previous examples of other museums, including the Tate Modern, end their contracts with energy companies, and that this campaign brings us, the people, the power to build a more ethical and democratic institution free from colonial violence and oily money. And in addition to this work, we also support university campaigns, for example, in the LSE, that are also targeting institutional partnerships with BP. Our second front is our international Stop Fueling Genocide campaign. And last year we mobilized around the COP that was held in Azerbaijan with comrades across the world and in Turkey to demand that Turkey and Azerbaijan stop fueling Israel with BTC oil. And this campaign, it received a lot of traction it was developed from the previous research that we did on the BTC pipeline. And consequently, because of this campaign, the Turkish energy minister actually claimed that they imposed an embargo on Israel and that they weren't transporting any oil. Of course, we knew that wasn't to be true. So researchers in our organization taught themselves satellite research to prove that Turkey was violating their own embargo on Israel and is actually making continuous oil exports to Israel with the same BTC oil that we know is refined into jet fuel once it arrives to Israel. And because of this, our research was held up in Parliament, and during the same time, people protested at docks against Turkey's complicity. And since then, we've seen that Turkey actually joined the Hague Group, partly because of this global pressure and they claim to want to take concrete action in support of Palestine. And one of the 6 measures they agreed to in the Hague Group actually included investigating public contracts with companies complicit in Israel's occupation. And through the Stop Fueling Genocide campaign, we will continue to hold Turkey to account on this and campaign for an end to the supply of oil to Israel through the BTC pipeline. And outside of the SFG campaign, we're also mapping BP's operations in Britain, and we're trying to seriously think about the demand for expropriation in Britain, especially with the new party formation that is developing here in Britain. Yeah, I think that's mainly it from us in Energy Embargo for Palestine. And thanks again for inviting us to this webinar.
Thank you so much, Camille, for introducing us and everyone to this really important campaign and the great work that you're doing. Yeah, I think it's, I would love to think more also about like the future of divestment campaigns as it happens. I think also specifically so important that you pointed out the kind of colonial continuities of the energy military infrastructure that continues to bind Britain to the ongoing colonization of Palestine. So thank you so much for your contribution. Third, we have Ines, who's an organizer with the Palestinian Youth Movement, a transnational independent grassroots movement of Palestinian and Arab youth struggling for the liberation of their homeland. So now the floor is yours. Thank you so much for being here with us.
Thank you. Yes, so my name is Ines, and I'm with the Palestinian Youth Movement, or the PYM, which is a transnational, independent, grassroots movement of Palestinian and Arab youth struggling for the liberation of our homeland, and the largest organization of Palestinian and Arab youth organizing in exile. And we're really grateful to be invited to this panel focusing on the role that companies play in the genocide. Because while we know, obviously, that Israel is carrying out this genocide funded and backed by the governments of the West, we also know that the unprecedented scale of mass murder that we're witnessing in Gaza wouldn't be possible without the corporations that are providing the weapons and making a profit off of the massacre of our people. And that is precisely why we launched Mask Off Maersk, which is our transnational campaign calling on the logistics giant Maersk to cut ties with genocide and demanding that Maersk stop transporting weapons and weapons components for arms manufacturers complicit in the genocide of the Palestinian people. So today I'm going to speak a bit about the role of the logistics sector and, of course, of Maersk in the genocide. And most importantly, I also want to talk a bit about how we can actually intervene in this role that corporations are playing. And the campaign that we in the PYM have been waging against Maersk for the past year. Because, you know, not only do we have a duty to fight for Palestine, we actually have the ability to directly confront these companies and Zionism as a whole here in the heart of empire. And we can impose a greater cost on these institutions that dare to reap profit off of the massacres in Gaza. And we can actually halt the flow of weapons killing our people. And this is something that all of us can have a role in. So first, I'm going to speak a bit to the role of logistics companies and why we're targeting a logistics company before focusing on Maersk specifically and the strategy of our campaign. So when it comes to logistics, obviously many of us in the global north experience logistics mainly as consumers. Logistics is presented as like an expert technical exercise that makes global production and trade more efficient. It's depoliticized and civilianized in how we understand it. But to understand logistics, we need to understand its origins in military strategy and tactics. So logistics actually emerged out of war as a science developed to effectively provision armies. It was only adopted into the corporate world of management after the Second World War. And the corporate logistics sector, in which Maersk is one of the most important players, is an afterlife and an outgrowth of the technologies of empire and capitalism. And without logistics, global capitalism today wouldn't function. Because almost every commodity in the world, anything that can be bought or sold, has been inside, or part of it has been inside, a shipping container. And weapons are no different. Logistics companies remain today a key strategic element of any war effort, and they are an essential part of the weapons industry supply chain. And so the way that the global arms supply chain works is that it's decentralized, meaning that there's no singular site of production for a weapon. So arms manufacturers outsource the production of weapons components around the world. The production of the F-35 fighter jet, for example, is sustained by more than 100 countries around the globe. And many of the components they produce are then placed on shipping containers and taken to weapons manufacturing facilities in the US, where they're assembled and then transported to Israel to conduct the genocide of Palestinians. And so we can think of weapons as manufactured across the logistics space rather than in one singular place. And in that way, transportation is actually kind of like an element of production rather than merely a service that follows production. And without that element, the weapons massacring Palestinians wouldn't be complete and they wouldn't reach the Zionist entity of Israel. So that's a bit about logistics kind of in general, and how logistics companies are in many ways the kind of invisible profiteers of weapons manufacturing. But what is Maersk's role specifically? So Maersk is involved in both of these aspects of the supply chain of death that I outlined just now. So taking weapons components from around the world to arms companies in the US for incorporation, and shipping completed weapons to Israel once they're ready. And so this makes Maersk obviously instrumental in the genocide. And it also means that Maersk connects all the different arms manufacturers together, meaning by targeting Maersk, we're targeting all of these arms manufacturers at once. And we've done extensive research and are continuing to do extensive research on the role that Maersk plays. And we've produced a number of research reports outlining this research that was cited by Francesca Albanese in her report that Michael spoke to earlier, which named Maersk a number of times. Our first research report from November of last year showed that from September 2023 to September 2024, Maersk shipped millions of kilograms of military goods across 2,000 shipments from the US to the Israeli military. And these shipments included hulls, engines, specialized parts for armored personnel carriers, tactical vehicles, and aircraft and projectile systems. These shipments also directly correspond to foreign military sales between the US and Israel. And the evidence that we found suggests that Maersk typically sends one ship per week from New Jersey, which each includes approximately 1,000 tons of military cargo destined for the Israeli Ministry of Defense. We also produced a report exposing Maersk's complicity in Israel's settlement economy and filed a submission to Francesca Albanese's office. That report showed Maersk's vital role in sustaining and expanding Israeli settler control over Palestinian and Syrian territories. And that research, with months of organizing and sustained pressure, then resulted in Maersk, one of the largest shipping companies in the world, actually cutting ties with companies linked to Israeli settlements and ceasing all shipments to and from settlements in the occupied Palestinian territories. Now, that was obviously, a historic victory for our campaign, but of course, the fight doesn't end there. And as long as Maersk continues to ship weapons components that enable the genocide and aggression across the region more broadly, our campaign continues. So we also produced a report earlier this year focusing on the supply chain of the F-35 fighter jet. That report demonstrated that Maersk is solely responsible for transporting parts essential to the critical functions of the F-35, including starting the engine, storing the fuel, repairing the batteries, flying and landing the plane, navigating in flight, communicating with other planes, loading the bombs and dropping bombs. And we found that since at least March 2022, Maersk has shipped the wings for every single Israeli F-35, including wings for 5 more that are scheduled to be delivered by 2028. And in terms of components arriving in the US for assembly, we also found that nearly all maritime shipments of components to the most critical production hubs for the fighter jet program have been transported by Maersk as well. So in short, the F-35, which is one of the deadliest tools in the Israeli military's arsenal, would not be possible without Maersk. But crucially, like I said at the beginning, we're not just interested in researching and proving Maersk's role in the genocide, we're actually interested in intervening in it. And that's why it's important that Maersk, is a strategic target for other reasons that factored into our decision to wage a campaign against them. Maersk is a commercial logistics company, meaning that the transport of weapons isn't its sole business. It's only one part of its profit margin. And so unlike, targeting a weapons manufacturer, where a successful campaign means shutting them down entirely, in Maersk's case, the weapons portion of its business can be targeted, isolated, and dropped. It's also a strategic target because it's an industry lead. It was the first company to pull out of the Red Sea, and like all other logistics companies followed. So winning this campaign could, set a precedent for logistics companies globally. But also Maersk as a target enables us to employ diverse tactics. It operates by land, air, and sea, which creates opportunities to intervene in a number of ways. And Maersk is everywhere, and we're a transnational movement, and Maersk operates, in all of the places that we organize in. So, so that I think, was also really important in our decision to target them. It also enables us to bring together broad sectors of society, because imperialism and logistics as a critical component of imperialism has ramifications for the working class, for the climate, for women, and for other manifestations of imperial violence. And it responds to what our community want and know is effective, which is targeting the arms trade. I don't have time to speak too much to the strategy of the campaign in any detail, but effectively, our strategy is to make it costly for Maersk to continue doing business with genocide by pressuring them through multiple avenues. And so there are several fronts of the campaign. And so if the strategy is the what, then the fronts are kind of like the how that strategy is achieved. And these include mobilization, media, labor strategy, shareholder strategy, legal, and more, all underpinned by the research that I spoke to. And I think one example of a victory that the campaign has had draws out some of these different fronts and how they work together. So if you remember the example of the first research report that I gave, where we found over 2,000 shipments of military cargo going from the US to Israel on a weekly basis, we found that almost half of those shipments passed through a port in Spain on their way to Israel. So what would happen is that a ship would take the military cargo from the US to Spain, where the goods would be transshipped, which just means like transferred onto another ship before the second leg of the journey to the Zionist entity of Israel. But what this meant by transshipping in Spain was that Maersk was actually defying Spain's commitment to not allow military cargo destined to Israel through its ports, which was announced in May of last year. So when we published our research findings, we also sent a briefing to the Spanish government, and Spain was forced to respond. And they responded almost immediately by blocking 3 Maersk ships carrying military cargo from docking at their port. And this kind of sent Maersk scrambling through the Mediterranean, trying to figure out how to get this military cargo to Israel. And the diverted ships, obviously rerouted, and they ended up docking in Tangier in Morocco to drop off their cargo, where they were met with mass popular resistance. Thousands of people protested outside the ports, and 10 Moroccan dock workers refused to load Maersk ships with the military cargo that was destined for Israel's genocide. Some of those dock workers were fired, and while the cargo was eventually loaded, those workers risked their livelihoods and their lives to stand with Palestinians and refused to be cogs in the machine of the genocide. And I think, as that example makes clear, this is a campaign that employs, many tactics in targeting Maersk, or many fronts, as I said. That win involved meticulous research. It involved mobilizations at ports, labor organizing, and a diplomatic strategy that was able to ensure that the Spanish government couldn't skirt their commitment to enforcing an arms embargo. But most importantly, I think it shows us what a people's arms embargo looks like. By coordinating and mobilizing civil society and grassroots groups across the world to place pressure on corporate and state actors to actually halt the flow of military supplies to Israel. And so I just want to conclude by returning to and highlighting the question laid out for us today, right, which is who profits from genocide? And this question is crucial because we have to understand that the corporations like Maersk that are making the genocide in Gaza possible are driven by profit. You know, they're not driven by morality. We can't simply ask them for an arms embargo. They speak the language of profit. And if the death of our people is profitable for them now, it's our job to change that profit equation. And that's what we're attempting to do in our campaign against Maersk. And that is how, you know, we must deal with every single one of these companies whose profits are covered in blood by getting organized and actually enforcing a people's arms embargo from below. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ines, for also giving all of us such critical and crucial insights into the strategies that underpin your campaign, but also how research can inform sort of new tactics that directly target complicit companies. I think that's been really great insight, and I think also your presentation kind of really highlighted the need to kind of acknowledge that a reckoning with global complicity in the ongoing genocide, Israeli-led genocide against the Palestinian people, also requires a reckoning with global capitalism and the violence of global capitalism. So thank you so much for your contribution and your work. Finally, we are very pleased to have Yasmin Mousselhi, who is a legal officer at the European Legal Support Centre, the ELSC, where she works within the Crimes and Complicity Department. Yasmin, you are free to start your presentation. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for the introduction, Sophia. It's an honor to speak alongside the other speakers. As Sophia introduced me, my name is Yasmin, and I'm part of the Crimes and Complicity team at the ELSC, which targets complicity across Europe. And I will be talking about the legal implications of legal action against arms transport to Israel. So it's quite related to what Ines has already spoken about. When we speak about legal action against companies and individuals involved in the transport of arms to Israel, we first look at which Israeli crimes to base the action on. The highest international judicial body, the International Court of Justice, has found that there is a plausible case that Israel's actions amount to genocide, which has already been highlighted briefly by Michael. And as such, Israel's political leadership is currently evading arrest warrants of the ICC. This presentation is not about proving those crimes. That work has already been reflected in those findings and also mentioned by the previous speakers. Our focus is on the legal pathways for holding to account those in Europe who knowingly enable and profit from those acts, such as the shipping companies, the executives, the financiers, and the insurers who form the logistical and financial lifeline of this trade. First, we identify the targets and jurisdictions. As mentioned by Ines, the arms supply chain is not a straight line. It is complex and multi-jurisdictional. There are multiple actors involved. First, the shipping lines, such as, for example, Zim Integrated Shipping Services, which is headquartered in Israel, but operates from European ports such as Rotterdam and Antwerp. We also have freight forwarders like DB Schenker of Germany, which have documented defense logistics contracts with Israeli companies. We also have port operators such as Eurogate in Germany or Port of Antwerp and Bruges in Belgium, where cargo is transshipped. We also, of course, have shipping companies such as Maersk. And essentially that expands the areas of jurisdictions, but also expands who we can target across Europe. We map three primary categories of targets. First, corporate headquarters, so where the parent company is incorporated, giving us access to civil and criminal litigation. We also target operational hubs, so ports, logistics center in Europe where arms components are loaded, shipped, or stored. Finally, individual officers, CEOs, compliance directors, and logistics managers who signed off on those shipments. Because these actors operate across multiple EU states, we can choose venues with the strongest corporate liability doctrines, the broadest extraterritorial reach, and the most plaintiff-friendly disclosure rules. As ELSC, we also need to identify our partners in the movement in those jurisdictions, both legal network as well as activists. Because as we have seen in our work, legal action alone is not enough. There has to be public pressure, and there has to be a very clear advocacy campaign alongside any legal work. One of the example of work that we've recently done was a case that we worked on called Catherine, Catherine, where we targeted a ship that was carrying weapons to Israel and military explosives. And essentially, this was coordinated with the BDS, where they were coordinating the mobilization of activists on the ground, but we would provide and we would send letters to the governments involved. And therefore, it was the vessel was rejected to dock in Malta, as well as Slovenia, Montenegro, and Croatia. And the flag state, Portugal, revoked the flag after we placed legal and advocacy pressure on them. While Albania accepted the vessel to dock, it unloaded the cargo. And we also launched an urgent petition in Germany before giving the flag to Catherine. But we received later information that the cargo was unloaded in Albania, and therefore the action was no longer of substance. Therefore, this is an example of a successful legal action, as well as advocacy work. But it's important to say that Catherine is one of so many vessels that carry weapons to Israel. Not only vessels, but different types of shipments through air as well. And therefore, the goal is to have every ship and every flight that goes carrying weapons to Israel and explosives to be like Catherine, that receives the same level of media attention as well as legal attention. There are different legal routes we usually consider. First, civil liability pathways. Several European jurisdictions permit civil suits grounded in complicity in international crimes. And this is an avenue we must take seriously, not just for the potential damages, but for the strategic evidentiary advantages it can provide in terms of disclosure of factual evidence. The legal basis can vary from negligence to breach of a regulatory duty. The proof comes from tracing the shipment, matching bills of lading and customs forms to batch numbers. It is very important to say that this is usually the most difficult part to prove. Essentially, it's difficult to prove that the same weapon shipment that we are targeting through legal action has been used for a specific attack. And this usually is quite of a technical difficulty, because when we have a claimant, it's difficult to say that the claimant who has been impacted by this attack was also targeted by this specific load of weapons, and therefore this evidentiary challenge is usually solved through factual research done usually by investigative researchers. Next, we also do criminal pathways. France, Germany, and the Netherlands, as well as Belgium, all have universal jurisdiction to prosecute war crimes and crimes against humanity committed abroad, including by private actors. But even under these broad statutes, prosecutors must show that the defendant's conduct was materially connected to the crimes charged, and crucially, that the defendant had dual intent to both cooperate and to facilitate the crime, which is extremely hard to prove. Belgium's universal jurisdiction law still allows prosecution where there is a Belgian nexus, but Belgian prosecutors will expect the same evidentiary linkage, prove that the goods exported through Belgian channels ended up in the specific unlawful acts forming the basis of the charge. If direct war crime charges face political or procedural hurdles, prosecutors can refrain to accessory to unlawful killings, illegal armed trade participation, or breach of export control laws. Even then, linkage remains central. To convict for illegal arms trading, one must show that the export violated the law because of its end use or end user, which again demands factual proof of the weapon's deployment. For both civil and criminal proceedings, the linkage requirement transforms litigation strategy. It makes factual investigation, serial number tracing, custom record analysis, satellite imagery correlation not an optional extra, but the backbone of any case that hopes to survive in court. Now we must confront the political reality. While the law allows these cases, the politics of courts and prosecutors' offices cannot be ignored. Many European governments maintain deep military, intelligence, and economic ties with Israel. Their own export control authorities have licensed the same arms exports that we challenge. Courts may be unwilling to set precedents that indirectly condemn their own state's complicity. Prosecutors may decline to act, citing insufficient evidence as a procedural smokescreen for political caution. Civil judges may accept jurisdiction in principle, but dismiss on standing, causation, or forum non-convenience grounds in practice. We will face arguments that every shipment was lawfully licensed, the commerce was routine, that the causation between a specific consignment and a specific attack cannot be proven beyond doubt. Standing rules may exclude NGOs or victims who cannot show direct harm. Access to evidence will be limited by commercial confidentiality and state secrecy. But it's important to say that the legal tools do exist, that the evidence does exist, and what is required is coordination. A network of cases across multiple jurisdictions, filed strategically with each reinforcing the other. One case can be ignored, but 10 cannot be. And it's important to say that no one can do this work alone. We need to work together on every level and on different geographies to deter and cripple this trade. Litigation is useless without public pressure and advocacy, and the ELSC always operates in coordination with relevant actors in Palestine and activists here in Europe. And and the goal should be to turn a global strategy on the arms trade to shield. To make sure that every port, every shipment, and every financial transaction is subject to accountability, both legally but also through public pressure. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Yasmin, also for speaking to the politics of the law that is so ever present, and yeah, and also for bringing it back to kind of the need of responding to this complex web of complicity that is often deliberately opaque, with also kind of a multifaceted and leveled response from the law, from activists, and from different angles. So thank you so much. That was a great ending to the presentations, and I think kind of brought a lot of strands together from Michael's presentation to Kimia's and Ines's presentation. So thank you so much. We have only a couple of minutes left for the Q&A. If there are no questions from the audience right now, or to encourage also maybe questions from the audience, I will ask a first question, which is addressed to all of our presenters. So I don't know if we can bring them all up onto the screen. That would be great. Thank you so much. Yeah, thank you again. First of all, to our speakers. Yeah, thank you, Yasmin. Thank you, Kimia. Thank you, Ines. Thank you, Michael. So as we give people a bit of time in the audience to think about a question, I wanted to ask, so we spoke a lot about different ways of campaigning to kind of call out, but also challenge ongoing complicity and the profiting of genocide. I wonder how you, in your roles, but also beyond, how you envision accountability and kind of a future reckoning with state and non-state actors' complicity in the genocide. Do you have political, legal, or other kinds of visions of how such a reckoning and maybe also redress for the profit made from genocide could look like?
I can begin, and I'll give you a lawyerly answer, but I want to fully emphasize again, as I said in my statement, my initial presentation, that law works in conjunction with many other spheres of activity and activism. It's but one tool in order to try to ensure that there is justice. Law does not have a monopoly on accountability with regards to this. But when we think of what the law can do, one thing we can demand of our political leaders is the full support of the work being done at the International Court of Justice with respect to the ongoing claim by South Africa under the Genocide Convention against Israel, and for the ongoing work by the prosecutor's office and by the courts at the International Criminal Court as well. I hear far less than I would like to hear from political leaders in the global north, in Europe and North America, support for the work that's going on there. Virtually all of these countries in the global north are members of the ICC and have traditionally supported the ICJ in its work. I've heard too many long gaps of silence with respect to this, and I think part of it goes to the fear of being seen to support the G word in their mind, or to the idea that there should be accountability. The idea that most of the efforts of leaders in the global north is to trying to get more food into Gaza. Yes, that's important. And spoken a little bit less urgently, trying to get a full final ceasefire. And yes, that is urgent as well. But nothing will fully address what we've seen in Gaza and what we've been seeing in the rest of the occupied territories unless there is going to be full support for accountability and for justice. These aren't crimes, be they war crimes, crimes against humanity, or genocide, that can simply be forgotten about when there finally is some kind of peace or semblance of peace in Gaza. The whole point of having an international legal system that people have fought for over the last 80 years is to ensure that the crimes we saw in the Second World War and the crimes we've identified in all of the international human rights treaties and conventions, international humanitarian law, international criminal law are enforced where they can be enforced, and that those who commit these crimes are punished appropriately so that there is much less incentive in the future for repeating what we're seeing today.
Thank you, Michael. Does any of the other speakers, do you want to respond, or also maybe have some other thoughts that you want to bring into this discussion, maybe also in response to the presentation, some of the other presentations you heard?
I'm happy to go next. I think that for what we do, what we try to do an energy embargo for Palestine through the BP campaign, and as I've seen through the MERS campaign as well, is just highlighting that it's people that hold companies accountable. Like as Ines said, we can't just ask these companies to just not divest in Israel. Like they're companies that make profits and are aligned with we're profiting from a continued flow of energy and arms to the global north. And I think the work that we try to do is to draw this gap between our political class and the people who in the global north do overwhelmingly support Palestine. Like the majority of the British public have actually campaigned and supported the demand around an arms embargo on Israel, and this is something that is obviously not represented in our political class. And the work that we're trying to seriously think about is with companies like BP that are private companies, what would expropriating them, so nationalizing them without compensation, what would expropriating BP, which also fuels fuel poverty at home in Britain, how can we link the kind of international struggles around BP's complicity in the genocide to fuel poverty back home in Britain, and how can we link these struggles together so people can see that it's companies like BP that are making profits both at home from exploitation and abroad. And I think a really good example for this is actually Colombia, where there's been they're kind of like legislating from below, where their oil company in Colombia like is probably one of like the most like fierce militant like actually publicly owned oil companies in the world, where even through like successive fascist governments, the oil company has actually managed to like stay militant and like hold power and even legislate from below, to the point that we now see a left-wing government and Gustav Petro actually trying to enforce an oil embargo on Israel. And I think like that kind of process of legislating from below is something that we all have to take inspiration from in Britain and the countries that we're organizing in. Like, how can we hold accountability by building a mass movement, by building like a popular movement around Palestine and being able to link it to our local conditions, and what companies that are aligned with state interests, by the way, like it's not the division necessarily between private companies and like state actors is not always kind of clear, but what these like the exploitation that these actors kind of like rely on and are founded on. But yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Okay, legislating from below. Ines or Yasmin, do either of or both of you want to respond, or have any final thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think obviously everything that's been said already, and like Camilla said, we've seen that the masses, whether in Britain or around the world, stand with Palestine, and this kind of powerful minority who have enabled and profited from and conducted this genocide, will of course be held accountable through various means, not least, I'm sure, the prosecution of war criminals in the future. But I do think, as Camilla said, that ultimately it's the kind of mass action and organization that I spoke to before in my speech that that will enable that reckoning to materialize. I think, like, with our campaign against Maersk, our goal beyond stopping the weapons shipments, which obviously is hugely important and is what we're fighting for, but beyond the campaign itself, like, the campaign is also a vehicle, right, to actually like build people power and to organize and to organize people, and to build power against imperialism here in the imperial core. And I think that that ultimately is what it will take, right? It will be, seeing politicized masses in political organizations, embracing a diversity of tactics, working in tandem to actually effectively confront imperialism here in the imperial core until Palestine is liberated and the region more broadly.
Thank you, Ines. Yasmin, do you have any final comments?
Yes, I think I just wanted to say that I think sometimes we also have to look beyond accountability and also look at rebuilding. I know it's hard right now to think of rebuilding and to think of what the future or Gaza would look like after the ceasefire, but it will happen. And I think this is a sentiment that I have taken from Ghassan Abu Sitta, who has always spoken of just thinking beyond just accountability and how do we use our resources and our different hats to center Gaza even beyond this point. And I think ultimately accountability is a really long process, and it will definitely take years beyond now. But I believe that we should all center Gaza right now, whether as students or as volunteers or as workers or as activists, whether legally or just, I think there are multiple ways we can still think of Gaza beyond accountability as well. So that's all.
Thank you, Yasmin, for bringing this into the end of our webinar. And thank you all. I think as long as sorry. I think as long as there are no questions from the chat, I think there have been no questions. So in that case, I want to thank you all for sharing your resources and all of your different resources with all the different hats that you wear and in your different roles, and providing us with many different avenues, with different avenues available to us, to all of us, to challenge the structures that make complicity in the genocide and also in ongoing colonial projects so profitable. So thank you so much. It's been a pleasure, and I hope to see you in different forums again. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you.
Everyone.